What we're trying to do is put a world in a grain of sand, or eternity in an hour, to try to get Kant within a very short period. I want to give you a sense of the critical project and try to work in the aesthetic within that context. What I want you to keep in mind, though, basically, this bipolarity of sensory field and the principle of being. Aquinas says being is the first thing that occurs within the mind. It's in intellect too. It doesn't come into the mind. It's the mind itself is the notion of being that relates us to absolutely everything and provides a principle of unrestricted generality. And that's the principle of non-contradiction. And that operates in terms of the interplay with our sensory life to produce our understanding of things, our life worlds, and so forth. Now, Kant has what he calls a critical project. It's the attempt to survey the character of human faculties and see their nature and limits. And we might start from what was on his tombstone, namely, two things fill me with awe: the starry skies above and the moral law within. The starry skies are the example of a mechanical system, and the mode of knowing that is, in one sense, very reliable is the knowing that takes place in terms of mathematical physics. So the first critique of pure reason, is dedicated to answering the question, what can we know? The second question with respect to the moral law is what ought we to do? And that's the critique of practical reason. Okay. And then with respect to the third critique, the critique of judgment, for what can we hope? And he thinks that if you work on the conditions of human structure, we can answer those kinds of questions in a methodical way. So he develops a kind of systematic inventory of the whole field of human experience in these three different areas, guided by these three basic questions. Now, Kant performed what's called a Copernican revolution in thought. Just as we look out at the world around us, we see the sun rises and sets every day. But Copernicus reversed the relationship, that the position that we have determines the way in which the sun appears, right? And so there is this distinction between the way things immediately appear and the way in which they, in some sense, finally are. And so what he's suggesting is that as we look upon knowledge, knowledge consists in adjusting ourselves to the character of what's presented. But for Kant, in order to do that, things have to adjust to us. First of all, in a sense, that in order for something to appear, you have to have eyeballs that tune in on certain wavelengths. And things have to adjust to that in order to appear to us. Right? So our sensory structure dictates the way in which things appear. Right? So they have to satisfy us, not subjectively, but in terms of human structure in order to appear at all. Right? Okay. But secondly, and more important for Kant would be that they have to also adjust to our categories, the way in which then our systems basically put together experience into consistent things, enduring through changes, and et cetera. So now, what you have to qualify that is this: things do not simply adjust to our structure in order to appear to us, but there also is our adjusting to things, presentations. So there is, in the third critique, the critique of judgment, two forms of judgment, what he calls determinative judgment and what he calls reflective judgment. A judgment is a relationship between the particular and the universal. Okay? In the case of determinative judgment, it's the judgments that are built into our structure, based upon our structure, where the a priori forms are given, where, for example, substance and accident, cause and effect, reciprocity, there are ways in which our system organizes things. Right? And so the universal is given in that sense in our structure. The particulars have to somehow be found to fall under that. On the other hand, not everything is given in that way. There are individual things given, and we have to figure out reflectively the categories to which they belong. And when he does this, he gets into the areas of aesthetic and teleological judgments. Okay. All right. So Copernican revolution concerns the adjustment of things to our basic structure as sensing beings and as intellectual beings. Right? But the reflective judgment is concerned with what we all think, namely we have to adjust to things because they present themselves in different ways. And so there's a twofold adjustment that has to go on, and you have to think of that. Because he's not simply saying our structure determines everything, but only the way in which things appear. The other thing you have to pay attention to is the distinction he makes between an intuitive knower and a discursive knower. Intuitive knowledge is what God has of things. God's intuition, so to speak, exhausts things, and his will makes them to be. But we haven't got that kind of intellect, right? We've kind of got the intellect that has to build up its knowledge discursively over time, right? And so he's giving us the kind of structure of human reality that makes possible discursive knowledge, an ongoing developmental apprehension of things. Okay. Now, let's look at really briefly, and I hope rapidly, the kind of structures he's talking about on the part of the knower. Just for a change of pace, I'll take black. So first of all, we have the field of sensing. Right? And he refers to the kind of knowing that we have here as a posteriori. Okay. That is, we know after encountering things. We have to depend on them in that sense. But there is a dimension of the a priori. That is, that which is already given in some way, to which organize the givens of sensation. And there are basically three a priori forms. One is the forms of sensibility. And those are space and time. Two are the categories of understanding. And three are the ideas of reason. And what you have to look at, come back to this preliminary sketch of the structure of the human experience, the notion of being is that which polarizes human knowing. The idea of being refers us to the whole, right? And so he's trying to move from the multiplicity given in sensation towards the unity that underlies the whole. Right? The ideas of reason are different types of unity. On the one hand, you have the cosmological idea. It's the idea of the unity of our knowledge of everything exterior to us, the cosmos out there. The psychological idea is the idea of the totality of knowing of our inward self. And the third is, called the ideal of reason, which is the idea of God fundamentally. is the underlying ground of it all. That the divine, if we could know it, would be that which would account for the character of the whole. These ideas are called regulative and not constitutive. What does that mean? Whereas the categories are what he would call constitutive. That is, what constitutes ordinary experience is the subsumption of sensible things under the categories. Right? That's our ordinary experience, right? But on the other hand, what's regulating the way in which we do that is the aim at horizons. And a horizon is a limit in some sense that moves when you move towards it, right? It's like a psychic hoop skirt, just like the normal horizon. At any rate, so you have these ideas, and the nature of the idea here is concepts to which no intuition is adequate. They can't be completely filled. The categories, let me just indicate some of them here. Let me focus on the main ones. Categories of relation, and this is substance and accidents, cause and effect, and reciprocity. Okay. He thinks these are given with the structure of humanness. They're the principles our system uses to organize our sensory experience. Right? And so all experience is experienced with these categories, right? All the time in some way. Right? These constitute the field of experience and its experiential enrichment and extension. The regulative ideas are lures. We try to move towards a complete knowledge of the cosmos. So science is an ongoing inquiry that expands, but is always directed somehow to the horizon of the cosmological idea. Okay, forms of sensibility. I think really important, I think he's perfectly right. Namely that we bring to bear upon our experience the forms of space and time that are given as indeterminately exceeding any moments of space and time within which we fill them. And that's the basis for abstraction. When you grasp something as an instance of a type, you grasp the form as repeatable anytime, any place you find the instances. And the question is, where do we get any time and any place from? We got these times and these places. Any time, any place is the contraction of the notion of being to the kind of being that is connatural to us, namely embodied beings, okay? Now what he's able to, well, let me back up one more step here. What he's looking at fundamentally is pure reason, which is the vehicle of metaphysics in some way, right? So he's trying to, and what he's looking at is the history of thought in which you get the first science to emerge, is geometry, and then you get the progressive development over time of various mathematical disciplines. So the house of mathematics gets more and more rooms added as we go. So it's a progressively developing science. The second derived from that is formal logic, which Aristotle worked out in his Organon. And the third is the application of mathematics to physical reality, which is from Newton on mathematical physics. Now he says each one of those disciplines is firm and fixed and developmental. So if you follow that kind of knowing, you have what we call responsible knowing, right? To think in those terms. Now, what status does geometry have? Well, in Plato, it looks like it belongs to some other realm, right? We're peering into an intelligible, superior realm above us. Kant's claim is this: what we're doing is analyzing the a priori forms of space and time. Right? Geometry gives us all the typical kinds of shapes that can appear within space, and so forth for all the different kinds of mathematical disciplines. Right? Okay. Now, formal logic is so let me say this. There is no Platonic heaven of geometry. Right? Geometry is the way in which the prescriptions of our mind, so to speak, the lenses of our mind are ground, as it were. Right? We look at things through space and time as encompassing holes, right? That we're filling in spatially, we're filling in over time. For example, based on biblical chronology, Archbishop Usher in the 1600s, I guess it was, calculated that creation occurred 4004 BC. That was the filling of the empty form of time based on biblical chronology. But now you have the tremendous wealth of empirical investigation that extends those things in light years. Just incredible distance taken by actually proceeding to work empirically and scientifically. Okay? Now, formal logic becomes kind of the key in the sense in which formal logic is an a priori, but belongs some sense to that which is prior to experience, and it holds apart from the changing character of experience. Formal logic developed over time tables of categories. Right? And it's those tables of categories that he's using to talk about the categories of the understanding. Right? So he's using formal logic as the clue to the a priori. Right? The question that he's after here is whether we can have what he calls synthetic a priori judgments. Not only sensory judgments, and not only a priori empty judgments like formal logic, but judgments in which you have both necessity and empirical content. Right? That's the synthetic a priori. And he says that's what happens in all these responsible sciences. You have an a priori element that has to be filled in some sense with sensory content. So he says concepts without intuitions are empty. Sensory intuitions without concepts are blind. Right? It's the togetherness of those that constitutes human experience. Okay, I think that's enough indigestible stuff. But I mean, you see, the general form of it, though, is to say there are reliable sciences that develop. Right? And these are the three basic ones that he's looking at. And he's looking especially at formal logic as the way in which we think about things, and therefore as an a priori. Right? It's an a priori of inference and implication. Right? But what he's after is an a priori of reference. What kind of categories do we use to refer to the actual things of experience? And this is the clincher, finally. What about pure reason? Reason that doesn't operate in those terms, but operates in terms of metaphysics. Right? And there you get attempts to develop proofs along these lines. Let me just say one thing, basically. When you look at, I'm sure you can't read that, the cosmological question, you run up against what he calls antinomies. Right? Two different opposed lines that can be equally argued for. St. Thomas discovered one of them. Namely, it was the question whether time has a beginning or an end. Right? And he said that can't be settled philosophically. Right? Aristotle said it's necessary that time be eternal because the now always is a movement from the before to the after. Right? And so there's no conceivable now that couldn't have a before or a now that wouldn't have an after. So for Aristotle, the universe is eternal for that reason. Right? The only way, he says, Thomas says, we could settle that question is God said, I started it. That's the only way you can get a solution to that problem. So there are metaphysical problems that are insoluble in terms of just pure reason. Okay? And even the proofs for the existence of God are, first of all, the cosmological proof proves only that there's a first principle, not the character of the principle. The teleological argument proves that there probably is something akin to intelligence on the basis of things, but it could be plural, it could be unitary. The look at things of both good and evil in the physical sense suggests there are more than one, and some of them are antagonistic to another. So you don't settle the question of the nature of God by going the teleological route. And thirdly, all of them depend upon what he calls the ontological argument. The argument from the notion of that than which no greater can be conceived. That's what we mean by God. But that which exists outside of merely being thought about is greater than that which is merely thought about, therefore God exists. And St. Thomas argued, as Kant does, you can't carry an argument from concept to existence. $100 in your pocket and $100 in your thought are very different, even though they're conceptually the same. Okay? So you can't argue from concept to existence. And so this knocks out the absolute certitude of proofs for the existence of God. Okay? But he has a back door, which he comes back on this. Because, and here's the real problem here, the notion of cause and effect. Because he's thinking about what's going on in physics, right? In cause and effect, antecedents are absolute causes of the consequence, right? And so there's a necessary connection between antecedent and consequent, and therefore you can't have anything as free action, okay, in Newtonian physics. There's a second dimension, and that comes in terms of the second question, namely, what ought we to do? And that entails responsible freedom. You can't be obligated unless you can do otherwise. And so that introduces a whole new way of coming at things through the moral order. And let me look briefly at the moral order. You've got, in the moral order, you have imperatives, things you ought to do in some sense, right? And for Kant, there's three basic imperatives. Well, two kinds of imperatives, rather. Hypothetical and categorical. Hypothetical imperatives are of two sorts. One, what you might call recipes. If you want to bake a cake like your mother did, follow the recipe. If you want to build bridges that hold up, follow the structural laws of physics, right? So it's an if-then situation. Also what he calls counsels of prudence. If you want to live a balanced life, then follow these kind of counsels. But it's hypothetical, right? And the notion of the moral order is not hypothetical if you want to, it's just categorically, that's how you have to do it, okay? And there are three formulations of it. One concerns the universalizability of maxims, of the principles through which we conduct our lives. And this is, he would say, commonsensical, in the sense in which you might ask someone who did some heroic thing, why did you do that? Because any decent person in my situation would do that. Okay? What they're appealing to then is the universalizability of the maxim that you're using. Okay? This is just a fancy way of saying anybody who's a decent person would do the same thing in these circumstances. The second is treat humanity, whether you're in yourself or others, as an end, and not simply a means. What he means by humanity isn't just persons, he means that particular faculty that makes us capable of being human, namely reason. Right? So treat reason in yourself and others as an end and not simply as a means. And the third brings these two together, and it's the introduction of the notion of the kingdom of ends. Yeah. So act as if your principles for acting could create the togetherness of human being over time. Right? Okay. So there's a kingdom of treating everybody as ends in themselves. And that entails ultimately developing your faculties and helping others to do the same. Okay. So those are two, what he calls these are incompletable norms. You can never say, well, I've developed my talents, right? No, it's an ongoing process, right? You can never say, well, I've helped people enough, right? It's an ongoing process, right? And all of that's aimed at developing this kingdom of ends. Okay, now, this involves what he calls three postulates. Freedom, immortality, and God. Let me back up one more time. Thinking this way gives us three categories, not simply moral and immoral, but moral, immoral, and amoral. The moral action is one done according to the norms for the sake of the norms. The immoral is against the norms. And the amoral is doing things according to norms, but not for the sake of the norms. So I do something noble because people will recognize me as being a great guy. That's amoral. It's a decent action. It's according to the moral order, but it's amoral. So it's only when you do things for the sake of the moral order. Now, this is important because what's going on here, the postulation of immortality, is because in this life, the notion of summum bonum is not realized. Summum bonum for him is the coincidence of happiness with deservedness to be happy. Right? He says in this life they don't coincide necessarily, right? Jesus and Socrates suffer even though they're good guys. So there has to be some way of justifying this. And the justification can't happen in this life, it has to happen in the next life. So the soul is immortal. And then you have someone who has to be able to read not only your actions, but your inner dispositions. Right? So you need an omniscient God who is also all just. Right? And see to the coincidence of happiness to be happy in the afterlife. Right? So he's got a moral argument for the existence of God right? As underpinning the whole moral order. Right? And he says the reason why we can't get to a complete knowledge, metaphysical knowledge through pure reason, is because we're not made to do that in this life. What we're made to do in this life is act according to the moral norms. Right? To build the kingdom of ends, that's our aim in some way. Right? Okay, now, finally to our subject matter, right? Namely the third critique. It's under the aegis of the question, for what can we hope? But that doesn't sound like an auspicious introduction to the aesthetic. But the third critique is called critique of judgment. Right? And we've looked at the constitutive judgment, namely the bringing of things under categories in our normal existence and our scientific endeavors. Okay? But then we have to look at the reflective judgment, and that is individuals are given, try to find the categories under which they fit, okay? Or the concepts under which they fit. So when you look out over the world, there are two areas that for which reflective judgment is required. One is the aesthetic, and the other is the organic. What you find in the organic is the subsumption of mechanisms under purposes. Right? Okay. And he takes that to be a kind of projection of our own activity, having ideas. We bring things, shape things in terms of reaching those goals. We use matter to do so. Aristotle argues that way in the physics, right? As in art, so in nature. Art requires an idea beforehand, requires an agent acting, requires stuff you work upon, and a form that you impose on it, right? And that then leads him to think back into nature itself as constituted by those four factors. In fact, three of those factors are what makes the soul, right? Namely, the ability to project goals and to arrange things to reach ends. Okay, come back though to the aesthetic, which is our real core here. First distinction is between free and dependent beauty. And I should have said before that there's two regions of aesthetic. One is beauty and the other is the sublime. Of course, the sublime then is involved in this feeling of awe, right? Okay, free beauty. In the natural order and in the order of art, okay, you have bird feathers and seashells. In the artistic order, you have musical fantasias and arabesque drawings. And the difference between free and dependent beauty is that free beauty has no antecedent concept connected with it. Okay? There's no notion of what things ought to be, as there is in dependent beauty. If you're dealing with a lion, you have to somehow represent the lion itself. So you're guided by a concept. But he wants to say that aesthetic judgment is based not on a concept, nor on empirical generalization, but based upon a direct insight into what he calls the form of the object. Right? And so form is the center, and it plays in relationship to what he calls charm. And that's reciprocally related to what he calls the form of the judgment. Which entails the harmony between understanding and imagination. That is, all cognitive activity depends upon that kind of harmony. Right? And what you're grasping, experiencing in the perception of the beautiful, you're grasping the harmony of you're experiencing the harmony of your faculties. Right? That involves also the enlivening of your faculties and the free play of those faculties. Right? Okay. Now, form and charm, the distinction here is that form, I mean, for example, a tune by Mozart, right? Played on the violin and played on the tuba. Right? So they'd have different instrumental timbres. Some might prefer the tuba, most wouldn't, I think. But it doesn't matter. That's different strokes for different folks when it comes to instrumental timbre. When it comes to the form, the musical form, that's the object of the beautiful, right? That's the beautiful object. That's what makes the thing beautiful, is the form it has. It has to be found in some kind of charm, sensory presentation, but it's the form that you're basing your aesthetic judgment upon. Okay. Now he goes through this rather strange exercise in working on the 4 characteristics of experience of the beautiful. The basis is the same basis as the categories of the understanding. They come from the tables of judgments in logic. Quality, quantity, relation, and modality. In each case, you have some very strange kinds of conjunctions. In the first, the beautiful is the object of disinterested satisfaction. This causes problems for a lot of people. I'm not disinterested when it comes to the aesthetic object. Well, what he means by interested is interested in terms of some appetitive gratification on the one hand, or somehow moral obligation on the other. So we have an interest in those things. The aesthetic object appears independently of our sensory gratification or our moral improvement in some sense. Although, as a side here, the moral order is, we advance towards the moral order when we learn to pay attention to things for their own sake. Therefore, distancing ourselves from our appetitive interest and allowing the thing to appear and give it unconstrained favoring. So you have this subjective experience, right? But it's disinterested and it's unconstrained favoring of the character of the object. So the first characteristic here is disinterested satisfaction. Sounds like a contradiction. Right? Okay. The second is, again, sounds like a contradiction, subjective universality. The idea here is this. It's that the aesthetic object is a unique individual object. The attention to it is ultimately such that all subjects should, in principle, learn to appreciate it, like Mozart, for people who listen to ragtime or something like this, right? That in principle, all should learn to appreciate the peculiarity of the individual object. So it's an obligation on subjects. And he says here there's a distinction between I like it on the one hand and it's beautiful on the other. Right? Say it's beautiful is to make a universal claim. That's what he means by subjective universality. The third is, again, an oddity. Purposiveness without purpose. And what the heck is that? It's in the mode of what he call as if, experiencing the beauties of nature, as if nature were organized in order to bring about the aesthetic experience in us. Right? The experience of the sublime is as if, again, nature is so organized in order to bring about our perception of the sublime. That's indemonstrable. It's only suggested, so we can't know the purpose, but we can experience this kind of purposiveness as if we were meant by things in the aesthetic order. Now, of course, when somebody makes something, it's intended for the subject. But on the other hand, you have the notion of genius. And genius is that through which nature gives the rule to art. That through which nature gives the rule to art. And so, even though an artist may intend something, the character of the idea he's representing is not given by, let me say this, some kind of universal faculty, but by a peculiar kind of giftedness on the part of the genius himself. So it's nature that's giving the norm through the genius, again, and not simply the individual. The genius operates in terms of an aesthetic idea. An aesthetic idea is the inverse of a rational concept. A rational idea is a concept for which there's no empirical filling. An aesthetic idea is a form for which there's no adequate conceptualization. Just the opposite. It's overdetermined. It sets the mind in free play to operate upon the character of the experience of the instantiation of the idea. To have it instantiated requires then craft on the one hand, but on the other hand then through the aesthetic idea, the production of what he calls exemplary originality. So genius involves originality, but not all originality is exemplary. I suggest looking at museums of modern art, it seems to me. The exemplarity is determined by the development of taste, which is a function of what he's calling the sensus communis, which is honed by the study of a canon of great works. So the capacity to develop and be able to recognize Mozart, right, requires a kind of history of great works that have survived the time since they were first produced, right, that continually appeal to people reflectively capable, right? And that sets the limits to originality. Originality there is, but not all of it's exemplary. And the exemplarity lies in the ability to recognize the form, which is taught by the study of classics. Okay? But the study of classics also should teach you not simply to appreciate the classics, but to have the ability to recognize additions to the canon. Right? There's always the openness to the possibility of development there. Okay, come back then, one final step here. Go back to the idea of the organic. When you look at the organic, green would be proper here. First of all, you experience a hierarchy, the food chain in some sense, right? And the top of the order is the human being. And the human being ultimately has a ultimate end and a final end, which is an odd conjunction, but the ultimate end for him is the development of culture. Yeah. The character of the human being is to work at the development of the kingdom of ends in terms of a culture of skill based upon a culture of discipline. Working at building up then the kingdom of ends. And the final end is the afterlife, in which the summum bonum could be realized. Okay? So there's a double end. Developing your talents, helping others to do the same, an ongoing sort of thing that builds up culture, that requires discipline and therefore virtues, right? Aimed ultimately as togetherness of human beings engaged in all kinds of constructive activities. Okay, now one more thing, come back to where we started, namely we started with the feeling of awe. Right? Two things fill me with awe. Awe is the result of the bipolarity of the human being. On the one hand, well, two forms of the object of awe. One is the mathematical sublime. What he means by that is that which exhibits itself as overpoweringly great magnitude. So when I look at the stars, the work of your hands, what is man? Right? The first feeling is one of insignificance. Right? On the other hand, the feeling of awe is not one of insignificance. It's an experience of a kind of exaltation. You're elevated in your self-feeling even by the character of the sublime. Right? And so there's this tension between the sense of our empirical tininess and the sense of the overarching character of being, but our own ability to rise to that. The second form of the sublime is the dynamic sublime, and that's experiencing, let's say, a tornado or a storm at sea and so forth, right? Again, we feel absolute earthquake, absolutely powerless in the face of that. On the other hand, the sublime feeling is a feeling in some sense that we're even beyond that in terms of our moral vocation. And so there's this double feeling that's involved. And it gets translated in Rudolf Otto into the notion of the holy, right? Mysterium tremendum est fascinans. It makes us tremble with fear on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're bound to it in some sense, fascinated by it, and we exist in that kind of tension. So in the case of the beautiful, there's a harmony between understanding and imagination. In the case of the sublime, a tension between imagination and reason. So you get these two basic kinds of aesthetic experience. And I think that covers the ground, basically. Someone said in our discussion last time, we can contemplate the coherence of great works of philosophy, and that itself is a kind of aesthetic experience. I never thought of that. I think that's what I'm trying to do in the book. In each case is try to get the whole round of concepts that fits together and accounts in some sense for the whole of our experience.